Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, rhythmic walk through the humid, shadow-drenched cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta, heading toward a small, flickering hearth in a wooden shack where the soft steam of a kitchen stove is about to change the world. We're talking about Madam C.J. Walker, the woman who turned a few tins of sulfurous ointment into a global beauty empire that stood as the thin, entrepreneurial line between a life of back-breaking labor and a legacy of generational wealth. You're standing in the late 1860s in a Louisiana town called Delta, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and for a split second, your hand hovers over the rough grain of a porch post. You realize that this quiet, muddy landscape is basically the high-stakes laboratory for the social theater of the Reconstruction South. Personally, I've always found it a bit absurd how much weight we place on destiny when, in reality, most empires are built on the sheer, stubborn refusal to accept a boring life of poverty. It's the only place in the world where you'd willingly trade your sleep for the chance to stir a pot of mystery oils until your arms ache. You probably won't survive the sheer, overwhelming boredom of tracing the specific cropline requirements for a 1870s sharecropper. But that's why we're here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're already halfway to dreamland, maybe just drop a comment with your location and the local time so I know where in the world we're currently haunting. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge away from the modern world of sleek, plastic-wrapped beauty products with their clinical marketing and sterile laboratory origins. You're stepping into 1867, the year Sarah Breedlove was born, and the first thing you notice is the weight of the air. It's not the clean, crisp air of a luxury salon. It's a heavy blanket of river mist, pine pitch, and the faint metallic scent of iron tools. Personally, I've always felt that 1860s Louisiana smelled like a combination of hope and extreme exhaustion, like the world was just starting to wake up from a very long, dark nightmare. It's an authentic, gritty atmosphere that I find strangely grounding, reminding us that every giant leap forward starts with a single, muddy footprint. Sarah was the first child in her family born into freedom, just 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a mainstream historical fact that carries a lot of narrative gravity. She was the first free in a lineage that had only known the rhythmic, brutal cycle of the plantation. I find it fascinating that while the legal chains were gone, the economic ones were still very much in place. Historians still argue whether the Reconstruction era was a genuine attempt at social engineering or just a messy, half-hearted transition that left millions in a state of legal limbo. Personally, I suspect it was just the usual human tendency to change the name of the system without actually fixing the plumbing. You see the cabins where Sarah grew up, rough-hewn cypress logs with gaps filled with mud and moss. It wasn't rustic chic. It was a survivalist architecture designed to keep out the rain, though it rarely succeeded. I've always thought that the layout of these early Delta settlements was a bit of a psychological test. You have the vast open fields of white cotton stretching to the horizon, catching the weak light of the rising sun, and casting long, spindly shadows across the dirt roads. I find it relating that even in a place of such limited resources, humans have always had this obsessive need to find beauty in the small things, like a bit of lace on a collar, or the specific way a headscarf is tied. A quirky tidbit of this era is that many families would use wasp nest tea as a medicinal remedy for various ailments. Personally, I'd be the one politely declining the tea and deciding that my cold wasn't actually that bad. It's a rhythmic, mechanical effort to maintain dignity in a world that wants to keep you in the dirt. You watch the young Sarah helping her parents in the fields. She isn't wearing a silk gown. She's in a heavy, homespun cotton shift that chafes against her skin. This was the era of the Cotton Kingdom in decline, where the soil was tired and the people were even more so. I've always felt that the cotton plant was the most demanding employer in the 19th century. It didn't care about your dreams or your politics. It only cared about the physics of the harvest. You can see the delta shadows stretching out as the sun sets, and you realize that for Sarah, the horizon wasn't a limit, but a starting line. Personally, I think the reason she eventually left wasn't just for the money, but because she couldn't survive the silence of the fields. Standing at the edge of the Mississippi River, you realize that the river was the original internet. It was the only thing that moved faster than a horse, carrying news, people, and the faint, distant scent of a city like St. Louis. I suspect the reason people felt drawn to the water wasn't just for transport, but because it promised a change of pace. It was an authentic, gritty bit of domestic sophistication to imagine a life where you weren't tethered to the dirt. You watch Sarah look at the dark, churning water, and the ripples seem to mirror the restless thoughts in her head. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the people who looked at the Mississippi and saw a road instead of a barrier. You settle into the stillness of the Louisiana night, listening to the faint, rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, muffled sound of a riverboat whistle. The silence of the Delta is a reminder that before Sarah was a tycoon, she was a girl with a very loud ambition in a very quiet world. Personally, I find it relatable that we all have that one flicker of a dream that keeps us awake when the world tells us to go to sleep. It's a long way to the mahogany desks and grand mansions of her later life. But the journey through the mud has begun. You close your eyes for a second. The heavy scent of magnolias and old river water lulling you into a state of historical peace. The fields are quiet, the stars are bright, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Sarah toward the riverboats. You take a final breath of the humid air, feeling the weight of the night pressing against the glass, and you wait. The river is rising, the trunk is packed, and the journey into the hard scrub of St. Louis, you leave the humid, moss-draped silence of the Louisiana Delta and follow the heavy, churning wake of a steamboat up the Mississippi, landing on the limestone-paved docks of St. Louis. The year is now the late 1880s, and the air has traded the scent of magnolias for the thick, industrial breath of a city fueled by coal and desperation. This is the hard scrub of the St. Louis riverfront, where Sarah Breedlove, now a widowed mother in her 20s, enters a world defined by the physics of the rub. Personally, I've always found it a bit grounding to realize that before she was the wealthiest woman of her era, Sarah spent 2 decades with her arms submerged in scalding water and lie. It's a brutal reminder that the most polished success stories usually start with raw, chapped skin. You're standing in a city of nearly 500,000 people, a chaotic hub of German immigrants, former slaves, and river gamblers, and you realize that for a woman with no formal education, the only path forward was paved with laundry. I've always thought that being a washerwoman in the 19th century was the ultimate roughneck occupation. You see the setup: a heavy galvanized tub, a corrugated washboard, and a fire that never goes out. It wasn't a domestic chore, it was an athletic feat of endurance. I find it relatable that even today, we complain about doing laundry when all we do is press a button and walk away. For Sarah, laundry meant hauling gallons of water from a communal pump and scrubbing the heavy wool and stiff linen of the St. Louis elite until her knuckles bled. A quirky tidbit of this era is that washerwomen often used bluing, a concentrated blue pigment, to make white clothes appear even whiter by neutralizing the yellow tint of age and sweat. Personally, I suspect this was the original optical illusion of the domestic world. You weren't actually cleaning the fabric better, you were just tricking the light into thinking it was pristine. I'd be the one accidentally using too much and sending some banker back to his office in a sky blue shirt, which probably would have ended my career on the spot. You trudge along the cobblestones of the riverfront, where the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and cheap soap creates a thick, sensory fog. This was the birth of Sarah's industrial grit. Historians still argue whether the extreme physical toll of this labor was what eventually drove her to find a better way, or if it was simply a period of necessary suffering to fund her daughter's education. Personally, I think it was a bit of both. We all have that one job that is so soul-crushing, it forces us to become creative just to survive. Standing in the steam-filled rooms of the tenement districts, watching the rhythmic motion of the scrub, you realize that the city was a heat engine. It consumed the labor of thousands of women to keep the boring USA looking respectable. I've always felt that the 1880s St. Louis riverfront was a very roughneck version of a community center. The communal washhouses were where news was traded and survival strategies were shared. It was an authentic, gritty bit of social networking. You see Sarah's brothers, who were barbers in the city. They lived in a world of sharp razors and aromatic tonics, a stark contrast to the lie and steam of her daily life. I find it fascinating that she was surrounded by the science of grooming through her brothers, yet she was stuck in the science of cleaning. It's a mainstream historical fact that Sarah's brothers were part of a growing class of black professionals in St. Louis who owned their own businesses. Personally, I suspect Sarah spent her evenings in their barbershop, soaking in the scent of bay rum and peppermint, realizing that there was more money in caring for people than in caring for their clothes. You listen to the physics of the city, the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves on stone and the distant, metallic whistle of a factory. It's a sound that signals a world that is moving too fast for someone stuck at a wash tub. I find it relatable that we still feel that urban anxiety today. The sense that everyone else is on a fast track while we're just trying to keep our heads above water. When you hear the rhythmic slap-slap of wet laundry against a wooden table, you're hearing the soundtrack of Sarah's 30s. Personally, I find the St. Louis years to be a masterpiece of patience under pressure. It turned a sharecropper's daughter into a woman who understood the value of a single penny and the exact cost of a gallon of soap. It was a rhythmic, damp pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of vocational necessity. As the afternoon sun dips below the skyline, casting long, rectangular shadows of the tenement chimneys across the muddy alleys, you realize that the doorbell of the hard scrub has a very weary, rhythmic ring. You're part of the washerwoman elite now, the ones who understand that the most important lessons are learned in the steam. I suspect the move from these hand-scrubbed tubs to the automated laundromats of the mid-20th century was a win for physical health, but a loss of the raw communal power of the washhouse. You look at Sarah's tired eyes, and you can almost feel the mercantile ambition of the 1890s. A bit of domestic theater that turned a gallon of lye into the foundation of a kingdom. You settle into the stillness of the St. Louis night, listening to the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cheap clock in a rented room. The gravity of the city is a reminder that in the 19th century, a woman's life was often defined by the strength of her back. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that Sarah managed to save enough money from $1.50 futurns, a day labor, to send her daughter, Alelia, to Knoxville College. It's a long way to the luxury cars and private estates of her future, but the grind has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic thrum of the city lulling you into a state of historical peace. The tubs are empty, the clothes are hung, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Sarah toward the crisis that would make her famous. You take a final breath of the coal and soap-scented air, feeling the exhaustion in your bones, and you wait. The steam is clearing, the sun is rising, and the journey into losing the crown, the scalp crisis. You leave the rhythmic splashing of the washtubs and step into a small, dim room where a cracked mirror reflects a sight that would strike terror into any woman of the late 19th century. The year is the early 1890s, and the air is no longer just thick with laundry steam. It is heavy with the chemical warfare of the era's hygiene. This is losing the crown, the scalp crisis, the moment where Sarah Breedlove faces the devastating reality of hair loss, a condition that was sweeping through the tenement districts like a silent thief. Personally, I've always found it a bit ironic that in a century so obsessed with Victorian modesty, a woman's hair was her only socially acceptable crown of vanity, and losing it was akin to losing her very identity. You're looking at a woman in her late 30s, her scalp patchy and inflamed, and you realize that for Sarah, this wasn't just a cosmetic issue. It was a physical manifestation of her grueling, unventilated life. I've always thought that 19th century scalp health was a very roughneck struggle. You see the problem? People didn't wash their hair every day, or even every week. Indoor plumbing was a luxury of the elite, and for the working class, a full bath was a logistical nightmare, involving hauling wood and water. I find it relating that we get stressed if our favorite shampoo is out of stock, while Sarah lived in a world where the only options were harsh, homemade lye soaps or heavy animal fats. A quirky tidbit of this era is that some women actually used kerosene or gasoline as a scalp treatment to kill lice and remove grease. Personally, I suspect this led to more accidental fires than actual hair growth. I'd be the one standing too close to a candle and turning my beauty routine into a local emergency. It's an authentic, gritty bit of history that reminds us that beauty used to be a high-risk occupation. You trudge over to the washstand and look at the tools of the crisis: stiff boar-bristle brushes that were rarely cleaned and shared combs that acted as highways for bacteria. This was the birth of Sarah's medical necessity. Historians still argue whether the widespread hair loss among black women in this period was primarily due to the lye-heavy laundry environment or a specific fungal infection called Tinea capitis that thrived in the crowded, damp tenement conditions. Personally, I think it was a perfect storm of both. We are products of our environment, and Sarah's environment was one of coal soot, sulfurous smoke, and the constant, drying heat of the wash fire. Standing in the foyer of her crisis, watching her touch the thinning patches at her temples, you realize that the scalp was a biological map of poverty. I've always felt that the 1890s was a very roughneck era for self-image. There were no dermatologists for washerwomen. There was only the old wives' tales and the dubious hair growers sold by traveling peddlers. It's an authentic, gritty bit of social theater. You see the patent tonics on the shelves of the local grocer, bottles filled with 90% alcohol and a little peppermint oil. I find it fascinating that humans have always been so desperate for a miracle cure that we'd rub almost anything into our heads if the label looked official enough. It's a mainstream historical fact that Sarah eventually began using a product called the Great Wonderful Hair Grower from a woman named Annie Turnbow Malone, a rival who would later become her greatest competitor. Personally, I suspect Sarah spent hours analyzing that tin, smelling the sulfur and the pine tar, realizing that the secret wasn't magic, it was chemistry. You listen to the physics of the itch, the rhythmic, maddening scratch of fingernails against a dry scalp, and the soft sigh of a woman realizing her hair is coming out in her brush. It's a sound that signals a very specific kind of domestic heartbreak. I find it relatable that we still feel that hair anxiety today, checking the drain after a shower, like it's a scoreboard for our health. When you hear the soft clink of a brush hitting a wooden table, you're hearing the sound of Sarah's lowest point. Personally, I find the scalp crisis to be a masterpiece of transformative pain. It turned a woman who was focused on cleaning clothes into a woman who was obsessed with healing people. It was a rhythmic, painful pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of dermatological hygiene. As the evening light fades, casting long, spindly shadows of the iron bed frame against the wallpaper, you realize that the doorbell of the crisis has a very sharp, rhythmic ring. You're part of the patchy scalp elite now, the ones who understand that real innovation often starts with a personal wound. I suspect the move from these harsh lye soaps to the pH-balanced shampoos of the 21st century was a win for scalp comfort, but a loss of the raw, desperate ingenuity that forced Sarah to experiment in her own kitchen. You look at her reflection in the glass, and you can almost feel the scientific hubris of the 1890s, a bit of domestic theater that turned a bald spot into a multi-million-dollar business plan. You settle into the stillness of the St. Louis room, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside, the distant neighing of a horse and the clatter of a coal wagon. The gravity of the crisis is a reminder that, in the 19th century, your health was often a luxury you couldn't afford. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that Sarah didn't just accept her fate, she started asking why. She looked at her brother's barbershop tonics, she looked at the laundry chemicals, and she began to build a mental poison register of what was killing her hair. It's a long way to the high-tech laboratories of the future, but the investigation has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the heavy scent of unwashed wool and wood smoke lulling you into a state of historical peace. The brush is down, the mirror is covered, and the boring USA is finally preparing to give Sarah the vision that would change everything. You take a final breath of the dusty air, feeling the itch of curiosity in your brain, and you wait. The dream is coming, the pot is waiting, and the journey into the dream and the sulfur vapor. You leave the dim, anxious reflection of the cracked mirror and move toward the heart of the home, the kitchen stove. The year is approximately 1904, and the air in Sarah's small living space is about to be transformed by a scent that most people would find repulsive, but for her, it was the smell of a miracle. This is the dream and the sulfur vapor, the legendary pivot point where Sarah Breedlove claims to have received her formula from a higher power. Personally, I've always found it a bit poetic that her empire wasn't born in a sterile laboratory with white-coated scientists, but over a cast-iron burner with a wooden spoon. It's the ultimate boring USA success story, where the mundane act of cooking dinner becomes the high-stakes theater of invention. You're watching a woman who has reached the end of her tether, stirring a thick, yellowish paste that bubbles with a slow, rhythmic glug. And you realize that this tiny pot is the crucible of a new era. I've always thought that the apothecary of the kitchen was a very roughneck version of science. You see the ingredients: petrolatum, coconut oil, and the star of the show, sulfur. I find it relatable that even today, we look for natural remedies in our cupboards, when the store-bought stuff fails us. Sulfur was a mainstream historical fact in 19th century medicine. It was known as brimstone and was the primary weapon against skin infections and dandruff. Historians still argue whether Sarah's dream was a literal visitation or a clever marketing narrative designed to give her product a divine competitive edge over Annie Malone. Personally, I suspect it was a bit of both. A moment of subconscious clarity where all the things she'd learned in her brother's barbershop and Annie's salon finally clicked into place. A quirky tidbit of this era is that sulfur was so ubiquitous that people would often take the waters at Sulphur Springs, smelling like rotten eggs for weeks just for the promise of clear skin. I'd be the guy standing downwind, wondering if the glow was worth the social isolation. You trudge over to the stove and look at the chemistry of hope. Sarah is mixing the sulfur with oil to buffer its harshness, creating a sulfur ointment that would actually stay on the scalp long enough to kill the bacteria and fungi causing the hair loss. This was the birth of Sarah's practical alchemy. I've always felt that the 1900s kitchen was a very roughneck laboratory. There were no temperature gauges or digital scales. There was only the feel of the spoon and the physics of the scent. When the sulfur hits the hot oil, it releases a heavy, pungent vapor that tickles the back of your throat and clings to the curtains. I find it relatable that we still tolerate stinky beauty products, like certain facial acids or tanning lotions, if they actually deliver results. For Sarah, that smell was the scent of her hair growing back. You listen to the physics of the bubble, the rhythmic, heavy pop of the ointment as it thickens. It's a sound that signals a very specific kind of domestic transformation. I find it relatable that we still find peace in the rhythm of the stir, whether we're making soup or a DIY hair mask. When you hear the soft scrape-scrape of the wooden spoon against the bottom of the iron pot, you're hearing the soundtrack of Sarah's breakthrough. Personally, I find the dream section to be a masterpiece of subconscious engineering. It shows that when you focus on a problem for 20 years, washing clothes, losing hair, watching barbers, your brain eventually hands you the answer while you're sleeping. It was a rhythmic, sulphurous pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of consumer problem-solving. As the steam rises, casting long, wavering shadows of the ladle against the wooden rafters, you realize that the doorbell of the invention has a very sharp, medicinal ring. You're part of the sulfur elite now, the ones who understand that a miracle often smells like a chemistry set, having a nervous breakdown. I suspect the move from these hand-stirred kitchen pots to the massive stainless steel vats of her later factory was a win for consistency, but a loss of the raw, spiritual energy of the original batch. You look at Sarah's face, illuminated by the orange glow of the stove fire, and you can almost feel the mercantile hubris of the 1900s, a bit of domestic theater that turned a grocery store mineral into a revolutionary scalp treatment. I've always thought that Sarah's decision to test the product on herself first was the ultimate roughneck move. She didn't hire a focus group, she became the focus group. It's an authentic, gritty bit of self-experimentation. You watch her apply the cooled paste to her own patchy scalp, the rhythmic motion of her fingers massaging the oil into her skin. I find it relatable that we still act as our own guinea pigs for new skincare routines. Personally, I'd be the one checking the mirror every 5 minutes, expecting to see a full head of hair in an hour. But Sarah had the physics of patience. She knew that growth was a rhythmic, slow process. It's a mainstream historical fact that her hair did grow back, providing her with the before and after proof that would become the cornerstone of her marketing empire. You settled into the stillness of the St. Louis kitchen, listening to the soft, rhythmic hiss of the dying fire. The gravity of the formula is a reminder that in the 19th century, your kitchen was often your only laboratory. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that Sarah took a common remedy and optimized it for a specific, underserved community. She wasn't just making a hair grower, she was making a black hair grower, a distinction that would give her a monopoly in a world that ignored her people's needs. It's a long way to the massive beauty aisles of a modern drugstore, but the formulation has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the heavy scent of sulfur and coconut oil lulling you into a state of historical peace. The pot is off the heat, the jars are waiting, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Sarah toward the mountain air of the West. You take a final breath of the medicinal air, feeling the weight of the secret in your pocket, and you wait. The train is whistling, the name is changing, and the journey into Denver Nights and the branding of Walker. You leave the sulphurous, steam-filled kitchen of St. Louis and step onto a platform where the air is suddenly thin, crisp, and carries the scent of pine needles and high-altitude ambition. The year is 1905, and you are in Denver, Colorado. This is Denver Nights and the Branding of Walker, the chapter where Sarah Breedlove finally sheds her past like a worn-out cloak and steps into the persona that would become a household name. Personally, I've always found it fascinating how a change in geography can act as a psychological reset button. There is something about the boring USA of the Mountain West that makes people feel like they can reinvent themselves by sheer force of will. You're watching a woman who arrived with $1.50 in her pocket and a few jars of ointment, and you realize that the Denver skyline, still low and dominated by brick warehouses, is the backdrop for the most successful rebrand in American history. I've always thought that the transition from Sarah Breedlove to Madam C.J. Walker was the ultimate roughneck masterclass in authority. After marrying Charles Joseph Walker, a newspaper advertising salesman, she didn't just become Mrs. Walker. She adopted the Madam title, a mainstream historical fact that served a very specific purpose. It mimicked the high-end French beauty culture of the time and demanded a level of respect that was rarely accorded to black women in the early 1900s. Historians still argue whether C.J. Walker was the silent genius behind her marketing or simply a supportive partner who helped her navigate the world of print and ink. Personally, I suspect C.J. Voorhees provided the technical know-how of the newspaper layout, but the raw, visceral will to sell was 100% Sarah. A quirky tidbit of this era is that Madam was a title also frequently used by clairvoyants and fortune-tellers. Personally, I find that fitting. She wasn't just selling a cream, she was selling a vision of a future where you actually had hair. You trudge through the evening streets of Denver, where the rhythmic clop-clop of horses is starting to compete with the occasional chug of an early Model T. This was the birth of the Walker system. Sarah, now Madam Walker, wasn't just selling a product anymore, she was selling a process. I've always felt that the 1905 Denver market was a very roughneck environment for a new business. You had to prove your worth on the doorstep. I find it relatable that we still respond to that personal touch today, whether it's a personalized email or a local artisan at a farmer's market. For Madam Walker, it meant walking the hilly streets of Denver, carrying her satchel, and offering free demonstrations. Personally, I'd be the one getting lost on the first block and accidentally trying to sell hair grower to a man with a perfectly fine hat. But Walker had a physics of focus. She knew exactly who her audience was. You listen to the physics of the pitch, the rhythmic, persuasive cadence of her voice as she stands on a neighbor's porch in the cool mountain air. It's a sound that signals the end of the washerwoman era. I find it relatable that, even today, the best marketing doesn't feel like a pitch. It feels like a conversation between two people who share a problem. When you hear the soft clink of a glass jar being opened and the rhythmic swish of the ointment being applied, you're hearing the soundtrack of a burgeoning empire. Personally, I find the Denver years to be a masterpiece of identity engineering. She realized that in order to sell a premium product, she had to become the premium product. It was a rhythmic, ambitious pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of personal branding. As the Denver sun sets behind the Rockies, casting long, jagged shadows of the mountains across the city, you realize that the doorbell of the brand has a very sophisticated, rhythmic ring. You're part of the Walker elite now, the ones who understand that a name is more than just a label. It's a contract of quality. I suspect the move from her small Denver apartment office to the massive mail-order business she was about to build was a win for scalability, but a loss of that intimate porch-side connection. You look at the first newspaper ad she placed, bold, clear, and featuring her own face, and you can almost feel the commercial hubris of the 1900s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a marriage into a corporate merger. I've always thought that the demonstration was the most honest part of her business. She would wash the customer's hair, apply the sulfur-heavy ointment, and then use the great, wonderful hair grower to show immediate results in scalp health. It's an authentic, gritty bit of hands-on salesmanship. You watch her hands, still strong from years of laundry, moving with a new, practiced grace. I find it relatable that we still love a live demo today, even if it's just a 15-second TikTok clip. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally spilling the water all over the customer's rug. But Walker moved with the physics of a professional. She was transforming the boring USA one scalp at a time. You settle into the stillness of a Denver night, listening to the rhythmic scratching of a pen as Madam Walker answers her first mail-order inquiries. The gravity of the mountain is a reminder that in the 1900s, you had to build your own bridge to the world. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she used Denver as a testing ground for the national expansion she knew was coming. She wasn't just a local success, she was a prototype. It's a long way to the corporate boardrooms of Indianapolis and New York, but the empire has been branded. You close your eyes for a second, the crisp, pine-scented air lulling you into a state of historical peace. The jars are labeled, the satchel is packed, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the power of the before and after. You take a final breath of the mountain air, feeling the clarity of her ambition in your chest, and you wait. The newspaper is at the door, the ink is wet, and the journey into the marketing of the great wonderful grower. You leave the thin, ambitious air of Denver and find yourself surrounded by a sea of newsprint, ink-stained fingers, and the rhythmic thump-clack of a manual printing press. The year is around 1906, and the boring USA is being hit by a wave of marketing that feels remarkably modern. This is the marketing of the great wonderful grower, the section where Madam Walker masters the psychological theater of the sale. Personally, I've always found it a bit brilliant how she bypassed the traditional, gate-kept retail spaces and went straight to the people. It's the 1900s version of a direct-to-consumer Instagram brand, long before the internet made it easy. You're looking at an advertisement in the Colorado Statesman, and you realize that the most powerful weapon in her arsenal wasn't the sulfur or the oil. It was her own face. I've always thought that the before and after photograph was the ultimate roughneck version of proof. You see the layout? On the left, A woman with thinning, brittle hair and a weary expression. On the right, the same woman, usually Madam Walker herself, with a thick, lustrous mane and the confident gaze of a tycoon. I find it relatable that we still fall for this exact same trick today on every fitness and skincare ad in existence. Historians still argue whether Walker was the absolute pioneer of this visual strategy in the black press, or if she simply refined a technique used by earlier patent medicine frauds. Personally, I suspect she was the first to realize that for her audience, the photograph was a political statement as much as a commercial one. A quirky tidbit of this era is that many hair growers were still being marketed using caricatures or white models, which was a spectacular failure of understanding the target demographic. I'd be the marketing intern pointing out that selling hair products to people using models who don't share their hair type is a bold strategy that usually leads to a very empty bank account. You trudge into a local church hall or a community parlor where the social theater is in full swing. This wasn't just a sales pitch, it was a hair culture seminar. I've always felt that 1906 was a very roughneck year for community building. You had to physically show up. I find it relatable that we still look for community in our brand choices today. For Madam Walker, marketing meant giving lectures on scalp hygiene and personal pride. She would stand at the front of the room, her own hair cascading down her back as a rhythmic, visual testimony. Personally, I'd be the one in the back row accidentally knocking over a display of jars, but Walker held the room with the physics of presence. She wasn't just selling a great, wonderful grower. She was selling the idea that you deserve to take up space and look good doing it. You listen to the physics of the testimonial, the rhythmic, hushed whispers of women sharing their success stories, and the clink-clink of coins hitting a tin box. It's a sound that signals the birth of brand loyalty. I find it relatable that we still check reviews before we buy anything today. Back then, the review was the woman standing next to you in the pews. When you hear the soft rip of a mail-order form being torn from a newspaper, you're hearing the soundtrack of a national expansion. Personally, I find the marketing section to be a masterpiece of aspirational branding. She transformed a medicinal need into a lifestyle choice, a mainstream historical fact that allowed her to charge a premium for a product that cost cents to make. It was a rhythmic, persuasive pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of influencer marketing. As the evening shadows grow long over the mail-order crates, you realize that the doorbell of the marketing machine has a very persistent, rhythmic ring. You're part of the consumer elite now, the ones who understand that people don't buy products, they buy better versions of themselves. I suspect the move from her personal door-to-door visits to the massive automated mailing lists of her later years was a win for efficiency, but a loss of the raw emotional power of the hand-delivered jar. You look at the Walker System pamphlet with its specific instructions on brushing and massage, and you can almost feel the educational hubris of the 1900s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a simple grooming routine into a science of beauty. I've always thought that her use of C.J. Walker's name on the labels was a very roughneck bit of legal protection. It made the business look like a family-run institution, which carried a lot of weight in the 1900s. It's an authentic, gritty bit of business strategy. You watch The Apprentice, actually just a hired neighborhood girl, labeling jars with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. I find it relatable that we still appreciate hand-labeled or small-batch items today. Personally, I'd be the one putting the labels on crooked and getting fired by lunch, but Walker demanded the physics of perfection. She knew that a crooked label suggested a crooked product. She was building a standard of care in an industry full of snake oil. You settle into the stillness of the Denver night, listening to the rhythmic shush-shush of envelopes being stuffed for the morning mail. The gravity of the brand is a reminder that in the 1900s, your word was your bond, and your photograph was your signature. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she used her own struggle with baldness as her primary marketing tool. She was the first user and the first success. It's a long way to the celebrity-endorsed skincare lines of the 21st century, but the influence has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second, the heavy scent of printer's ink and sulfurous ointment lulling you into a state of historical peace. The ads are placed, the orders are coming in, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the heat of the steel comb. You take a final breath of the ink-scented air, feeling the power of the image in your mind, and you wait. The stove is heating up, the iron is ready, and the journey into steel combs and the soft kitchen steam. You leave the rhythmic rustle of the morning newspapers and step back into the localized warmth of the kitchen. But this time, the scent of sulfur is mingling with something new. The sharp, metallic smell of hot iron, and the faint, toasted aroma of scorched hair. The year is now roughly 1908, and the boring USA is witnessing a revolution in the morphology of the tool. This is Steel Combs and the Soft Kitchen Steam, the chapter where Madam Walker perfects the press and curl method. Personally, I've always found it a bit terrifying that the pinnacle of 20th century glamour relied so heavily on placing a piece of high-carbon steel into a 400-degree fire, and then bringing it within centimeters of your own scalp. It's the ultimate roughneck beauty ritual, where one distracted second can lead to a permanent scar and a very bad afternoon. You're watching the apprentice heat a heavy brass-backed comb over the gas jet, and you realize that this isn't just grooming, it's a high-stakes engineering project. I've always thought that the hot comb was the ultimate physics of transformation. You see the design, a heavy handle, a thick spine to retain heat, and teeth that are spaced with mathematical precision to glide through the thickest textures. I find it relatable that we still use heat styling today, though our modern ceramic flat irons are a lot more forgiving than a rod of iron heated on a kitchen stove. Historians still argue whether Madam Walker actually invented the hot comb or if she simply refined a French design from the 1870s called the Marcel Gratteau iron. Personally, I suspect the French version was designed for thin, Caucasian hair, while Walker's specialty steel was the first to be ruggedized for the specific tensile strength of black hair. A quirky tidbit of this era is that, before the standardized steel comb, some women would actually use a clothing iron on a flat board to straighten their hair. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally ironing my ear to my shoulder, a mistake that is very difficult to explain to your bridge club. You trudge over to the kitchen table, which has been transformed into a beauty station. Here, the soft kitchen steam isn't just from a boiling pot. It's the moisture released when the hot metal hits the glycine, Walker's proprietary petroleum-based pressing oil. This was the birth of the smoke and mirror effect. I've always felt that 1908 was a very roughneck year for hair chemistry. You had to balance the flash point of the oil against the temperature of the iron. If the oil is too thin, the hair burns. If it's too thick, the hair becomes a greasy, heavy curtain. I find it relatable that we still struggle with product-to-heat ratios today in our own bathrooms. Standing in the foyer of the kitchen, watching the rhythmic tis-tis sound as the comb touches a damp strand of hair, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had moved into the vanity of the present. You listen to the physics of the sizzle, the rhythmic, sharp hiss of steam being forced out of the hair shaft. It's a sound that signals a very specific kind of chemical victory. I find it relatable that we still associate that sizzle with a transformation, whether we're searing a steak or curling our hair. When you hear the soft clink of the comb being returned to its heating rack, you're hearing the soundtrack of a million Saturday nights. Personally, I find the steel comb section to be a masterpiece of tool-based identity. Madam Walker realized that her oils were only half the battle. The other half was the mechanical force required to redistribute the hair's natural bonds. It was a rhythmic, smoky pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of thermal styling. As the afternoon light filters through the steam, casting long, wavering shadows of the comb's teeth against the apron of the apprentice, you realize that the doorbell of the hot iron has a very rhythmic, metallic ring. You're part of the press and curl elite now. The ones who understand that beauty often requires a brush with the elements. I suspect the move from these kitchen fire combs to the electric curling irons of the 1920s was a win for fire safety, but a loss of the raw, tactile mastery required to gauge the heat by holding the iron near your cheek. You look at the glycine tin with its instructions on how to apply the grease before the heat, and you can almost feel the thermodynamic hubris of the 1900s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a kitchen chore into a professional service. I've always thought that the comb test was the most honest part of the routine. You take a piece of newspaper and run the hot comb through it. If the paper turns brown or catches fire, the iron is too hot for the hair. It's an authentic, gritty bit of frontier safety. You watch the apprentice perform the test with a rhythmic, practiced motion. I find it relatable that we still test things today, like checking the temperature of the water before jumping into a shower. Personally, I'd be the one skipping the test, burning a hole through my bangs, and spending the next 6 months wearing a very large, very suspicious-looking hat. Walker, however, demanded scientific precision. She was turning the boring USA into a population of amateur chemists. You settle into the stillness of the afternoon, watching the way the soft steam settles on the windows, blurring the Denver skyline into a hazy charcoal dream. The gravity of the iron is a reminder that in the 1900s, looking respectable was a labor-intensive process that started at the stove. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the women who mastered this art, the ones who could navigate the heat and the smoke to create a moment of elegance in a hard, muddy world. It's a long way to the high-tech, ionic, tourmaline-infused tools of the 21st century, but the pressing has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic hiss-hiss of the comb lulling you into a state of historical peace. The iron is cooling, the glycine is set, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the massive industrial expansion of the East. You take a final breath of the scorched oil air, feeling the warmth of the ritual in your bones, and you wait. The train is calling, the factory is waiting, and the journey into the Pittsburgh expansion and Lelia College. You leave the cozy, scorched oil intimacy of the Denver kitchen and find yourself on a train heading east, the rhythmic clack-clack of the steel wheels matching the ambitious beat of your heart. The year is 1908, and you are stepping onto the soot-stained platforms of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is the Pittsburgh expansion and Lelia College, the chapter where a local success story scales into a vocational empire. Personally, I've always found the leap from making it to teaching it to be the most underrated part of the American dream. It's one thing to sell a jar of ointment, but it's a whole different level of boring USA genius to sell a career. You're looking at a city dominated by the hulking, fiery silhouettes of steel mills. And you realize that Madam Walker isn't here to compete with Andrew Carnegie. She's here to build a different kind of infrastructure. I've always thought that the founding of Lelia College, named after her daughter, Alelia, was the ultimate roughneck version of a PhD program. You see, the curriculum, it wasn't just about the physics of the press and curl. It was a comprehensive system that included hair culture, scalp hygiene, and, most importantly, the business of the sale. I find it relatable that even today, we value mentorship and certification as the keys to escaping the 9-to-5 grind. Historians still argue whether Walker's insistence on standardized training was a way to maintain quality control or a clever method to create a captive market for her products. Personally, I suspect it was a masterful blend of both. If you train the stylist, you own the shelf space. A quirky tidbit of this era is that Lelia College was often housed in converted townhouses or basement suites, turning domestic spaces into academies of beauty. I'd be the one accidentally wandering into the wrong basement and trying to order a sandwich, while 20 women are learning the molecular structure of sulfur. You trudge into the Pittsburgh headquarters at 1648 Wiley Avenue, where the air is thick with the scent of wonderful hair grower and the determined energy of dozens of students. This was the birth of the Walker agent. I've always felt that 1909 was a very roughneck year for female empowerment. Before the 19th Amendment gave women the vote, Madam Walker gave them a bank account. I find it relatable that we still talk about side hustles today as a path to freedom. For a black woman in 1908, being a Walker agent was the difference between scrubbing floors for a few cents and owning a home. Standing in the foyer of the college, watching the rhythmic motion of students practicing on wooden mannequin heads, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the university of the future. You listen to the physics of the lecture, the rhythmic, authoritative cadence of Madam Walker explaining the importance of cleanliness and comeliness. It's a sound that signals a shift from worker to executive. I find it relatable that we still get that specific classroom hush when someone who has actually done the work starts to speak. When you hear the soft scratch-scratch of pencils on paper as students record the steps of the Walker system, you're hearing the soundtrack of thousands of lives being redesigned. Personally, I find the Pittsburgh expansion to be a masterpiece of scalable mentorship. She realized that she couldn't be on every porch in America, so she built an army to do it for her. It was a rhythmic educational pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of vocational mobility. As the industrial haze of Pittsburgh filters through the windows, casting long, dusty shadows of the drying racks across the floorboards, you realize that the doorbell of the college has a very frequent, rhythmic ring. You're part of the certified elite now, the ones who understand that knowledge is the only product that doesn't deplete when you sell it. I suspect the move from these intimate local colleges to the massive, centralized correspondence courses of her later years was a win for reach, but a loss of the raw, tactile feedback of the classroom. You look at the Lelia College diploma, with its ornate border and official gold seal, and you can almost feel the credentialing hubris of the 1900s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a kitchen secret into a licentiate of hair culture. I've always thought that the agent uniform was the most brilliant part of the marketing. She required her agents to wear a crisp white shirtwaist and a long black skirt, mimicking the look of a nurse or a professional scientist. It's an authentic, gritty bit of psychological warfare against prejudice. You watch the students don their uniforms with a rhythmic, practiced dignity. I find it relatable that we still dress for the job we want today, using clothes as a suit of armor against the world's expectations. Personally, I'd be the one with the coffee stain on my white blouse 5 minutes after putting it on. But Walker demanded aesthetic integrity. She was turning the boring USA into a place where a black woman's professionalism was undeniable. You settle into the stillness of the Pittsburgh evening, watching the way the orange glow of the steel mills reflects off the window panes. The gravity of the campus is a reminder that in the 1900s, education was something you often had to build for yourself. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she moved to Pittsburgh specifically because it was a hub of black commerce and migration. She went where the people were. It's a long way to the massive, sterile corporate campuses of the 21st century. But the scaling has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic shush-shush of the students' brushes lulling you into a state of historical peace. The notebooks are closed, the uniforms are pressed, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the industrial heart of Indianapolis. You take a final breath of the coal and sulfur air, feeling the expansion in your chest, and you wait. The factory blueprints are unrolled, the land is bought, and the journey into Indianapolis, the industrial heart of beauty. You leave the soot-caked hills of Pittsburgh behind and follow the iron rails into the flat, sprawling Midwestern hub of Indianapolis. The year is 1910, and you are stepping into the crossroads of America, where the air is thick with the scent of roasted corn, engine oil, and a very specific, rising ambition. This is Indianapolis, the industrial heart of beauty, the chapter where Madam Walker transitions from a series of basement labs to a full-scale manufacturing powerhouse. Personally, I've always found it a bit poetic that she chose Indianapolis. It was a city obsessed with speed and the physics of the engine, being the home of the newly built Motor Speedway. You're looking at a plot of land on Northwest Street, and you realize that Madam Walker isn't just building a shop. She's building a machine for progress. I've always thought that the 1910 Walker factory was the ultimate roughneck version of a high-stakes laboratory. You see the floor plan. It wasn't just a bottling plant, it included a hair salon, a manicure parlor, and a massive research facility. I find it relatable that even today, we love a flagship store that offers an immersive experience. Historians still argue whether Walker moved to Indianapolis because of its superior rail connections or because the city had a thriving black middle class that offered the perfect infrastructure of support. Personally, I suspect it was the rails. If you want to conquer the world, you need to be at the center of the map. A quirky tidbit of this era is that the factory used massive, steam-jacketed kettles to mix the wonderful hair grower, which looked more like something you'd find in a soup cannery than a beauty parlor. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally falling into the vat and emerging as the most well-conditioned human in Indiana, a mistake that would probably take weeks to wash off. You trudge onto the factory floor, where the physics of the batch is in full swing. This wasn't the rhythmic scrape-scrape of a wooden spoon in a kitchen anymore. It was the heavy industrial thrum-thud of mechanical agitators. I've always felt that 1911 was a very roughneck year for quality control. You had to ensure that the sulfur didn't settle at the bottom of 1,000 jars. I find it relatable that we still worry about consistency in our favorite products today. Standing in the foyer of the new factory, watching the rhythmic motion of the assembly line, which was almost entirely staffed by black women in crisp uniforms, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the industrial fortress of the future. You listen to the physics of the factory, the rhythmic, metallic clink-clink of glass jars hitting the conveyor, and the hiss of the steam pipes. It's a sound that signals the death of the small batch era. I find it relatable that we still find a strange, hypnotic peace in the rhythm of the machine, Like watching those satisfying factory videos on social media. When you hear the heavy thump of a shipping crate being sealed, you're hearing the soundtrack of a national supply chain. Personally, I find the Indianapolis move to be a masterpiece of vertical integration. She didn't just make the product. She owned the factory, the school, the warehouse, and the shipping department. It was a rhythmic, industrial pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of black corporate power. As the Indiana sun sets over the smokestacks, casting long rectangular shadows of the factory windows across the production floor, you realize that the doorbell of the Heart of Beauty has a very loud, rhythmic ring. You're part of the industrial elite now, the ones who understand that to change a culture, you have to build a factory. I suspect the move from her personal supervision of every pot to this delegated mechanized system was a win for wealth, but a loss of the raw, tactile connection to the sulfur vapor. You look at the blueprints for the expanded Walker Building, with its planned theater and ballroom, and you can almost feel the civic hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a manufacturing plant into a community anchor. I've always thought that the laboratory was the most honest part of the building. She hired professional chemists to analyze her formulas and ensure they met the standards of the pharmacopoeia. It's an authentic, gritty bit of scientific validation. You watch the chemist, one of the few black professionals in the field, titrating a solution with rhythmic, practiced precision. I find it relatable that we still look for that dermatologist-tested label today to feel safe. Personally, I'd be the one blowing up a beaker of nitric acid and being politely asked to stick to the marketing department. But Walker demanded chemical integrity. She was turning the boring USA into a place where black beauty was backed by hard science. You settle into the stillness of the Indianapolis evening, watching the way the red brick of the factory seems to glow in the twilight. The gravity of the industry is a reminder that in the 1910s, building a factory was the ultimate act of defiance. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she ignored the experts who told her that a black woman couldn't handle the physics of manufacturing. She didn't just handle it, she optimized it. It's a long way to the high-tech, robotic fulfillment centers of the 21st century, but the mass production has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic whir-click of the labeling machine lulling you into a state of historical peace. The jars are filled, the crates are stacked, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward her army of white blouses. You take a final breath of the oil and brick air, feeling the momentum in your bones, and you wait. The roll call is starting, the uniforms are ready, and the journey into the Walker Agents, a sea of white blouses. You leave the metallic thrum of the Indianapolis factory floor and step into a grand assembly hall where the air is suddenly crisp, organized, and filled with the soft rustle of starch. The year is 1912, and you are staring into a sea of white blouses. This is the chapter of the Walker Agents, the moment where Madam Walker transforms her workforce into a disciplined, regulated army of economic liberation. Personally, I've always found it a bit genius how she used a uniform code to bypass the visual prejudices of the era. In a world that saw a black woman and immediately thought domestic servant, Walker's agents appeared as polished, middle-class professionals. You're looking at hundreds of women in pristine white shirtwaists and long black skirts, and you realize that this isn't just a sales meeting, it's a legislative chill aimed at the status quo of the boring USA. I've always thought that the Walker agent system was the original roughneck version of a franchise model. You see the structure, It wasn't enough to just buy the products. You had to be walkerized. You had to master the physics of the system, from the specific pressure of the scalp massage to the precise way you pitched the wonderful hair grower. I find it relatable that we still see this today in everything from high-end real estate to tech sales. The idea that you aren't just selling a product. You're selling a standard of excellence. Historians still argue whether Walker's strict rules for her agents' personal lives, forbidding them from selling rival products, or engaging in undignified behavior, was a form of corporate overreach or a necessary shield to protect the brand's hard-won respectability. Personally, I suspect it was survival. If one agent looked roughneck, the whole empire looked like a fraud. A quirky tidbit of this era is that Walker created a national beauty culturists and benevolent association specifically for her agents, essentially creating a private social safety net long before the government thought of it. You trudge through a regional convention where the physics of the pep rally is in full swing. This wasn't the quiet, lonely door-to-door slog of the Denver days. This was a direct sales force with the energy of a religious revival. I've always felt that 1913 was a very roughneck year for female solidarity. You see the agent prizes, gold medals and cash bonuses for the women who sold the most or opened the most new territories. I find it relatable that we still use gamification to motivate ourselves today, though I doubt many of us are working for a gold medal from a hair grease tycoon. Standing in the foyer of the convention, watching the rhythmic motion of women exchanging business cards and success maps, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the corporate networking of the future. You listen to the physics of the roll call, the rhythmic, proud response of women announcing their sales figures from cities like Memphis, Chicago, and Little Rock. It's a sound that signals a massive redistribution of wealth. I find it relatable that we still feel that team spirit when we're part of something bigger than ourselves, even if it's just a specialized Discord server. When you hear the rhythmic shush-shush of silk-lined bags being opened as agents prepare for their demonstrations, you're hearing the soundtrack of 20,000 women gaining financial independence. Personally, I find the agent section to be a masterpiece of human capital. She didn't just build a factory of machines, she built a factory of people. It was a rhythmic, organized pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of black middle-class mobility. As the convention hall lights dim, casting long, elegant shadows of the white blouses against the velvet curtains, you realize that the doorbell of the sales army has a very authoritative, rhythmic ring. You're part of the agent elite now, the ones who understand that a brand is only as strong as the person holding the jar. I suspect the move from these hand-selected, personally trained agents to the massive, anonymous retail shelves of the 1940s was a win for convenience, but a loss of the raw, mentorship-driven power of the Walker system. You look at the agent manual, with its scripts for overcoming objections and its detailed diagrams of hair follicles, and you can almost feel the corporate hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a neighborly recommendation into a professional consultation. I've always thought that the convention speech was the most honest part of the system. Walker would stand before her sea of white blouses and tell them plainly, "I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South." It's an authentic, gritty bit of leadership by example. You watch the agents, many of them former washerwomen themselves, nodding in a rhythmic, soulful unison. I find it relatable that we still look for authenticity in our leaders today. Personally, I'd be the one in the audience getting so inspired, I'd try to sell a jar to the person sitting right next to me. But these women had the physics of discipline. They were turning the boring USA into a landscape of self-made women. You settle into the stillness of the assembly hall as the agents disperse into the night, their white blouses glowing like ghosts in the twilight. The gravity of the force is a reminder that in the 1910s, a black woman's best defense against a hostile world was her own paycheck. Personally, I find a lot of respect in those 20,000 agents, the ones who braved segregated trains and dusty roads to bring comeliness to the masses. It's a long way to the massive digital multi-level marketing schemes of the 21st century, but the sales force has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic clack-clack of the agent's heels on the stone steps lulling you into a state of historical peace. The orders are taken, the territories are assigned, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the glitz and glamour of the Harlem Renaissance. You take a final breath of the starchy, lavender-scented air, feeling the strength of the collective in your bones, and you wait. The brownstone is calling. The Hudson is waiting, and the journey into Harlem Renaissance and the mansion of dreams. You leave the orderly, starchy ranks of Indianapolis and step into the electric, jazz-infused air of Upper Manhattan. The year is 1916, and you are breathing in the physics of the new Negro movement. This is Harlem Renaissance and the Mansion of Dreams, the chapter where Madam Walker cements her status as the ultimate cultural icon. Personally, I've always found it a bit poetic that she moved her base of operations to Harlem, just as it was becoming the intellectual and artistic heartbeat of Black America. It's like a modern tech mogul moving to Silicon Valley right as the first microchip was being soldered. You're looking at a grand vertical landscape of brownstones and theaters, and you realize that Madam Walker isn't just a business owner anymore. She is the social architect of the boring USA. I've always thought that Walker's move to Harlem was the ultimate roughneck version of a victory lap. You see the evidence of her success in the Walker Theater and Office Building on 136th Street. But the real showstopper is Villa Lewaro, her 34-room Italianate mansion in Irvington-on-Hudson. Personally, I find it hilarious and deeply relatable that she built a $250,000 estate right in the middle of a neighborhood filled with the Rockefeller and Gould families. It's the original power move, designed to make the neighbors very, very uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether her lavish spending was a sign of nouveau riche excess or a calculated political statement that a black woman could master the physics of luxury as well as any industrialist. Personally, I suspect it was a bit of both. If you've spent 20 years scrubbing other people's clothes in a lie-filled basement, you've earned the right to have a pipe organ that plays by itself. A quirky tidbit of this era is that the name Villa Lewaro was actually an acronym created by Enrico Caruso, using the first two letters of her daughter's name. Lelia Walker Robinson. You trudge through the wide hallways of Villa Lewaro, where the air is scented with expensive perfume, beeswax, and the faint, lingering smell of the Hudson River. This was the birth of high society activism. I've always felt that 1917 was a very roughneck year for the American aristocracy. You had to have a salon where the brightest minds gathered. I find it relatable that we still value these think tanks today, though now they usually happen on private islands or in gated tech campuses. Standing in the foyer of her mansion, watching the rhythmic motion of the white-gloved staff, serving tea to intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the diplomatic hub of the future. You listen to the physics of the party, the rhythmic, distant melody of a player piano, and the sophisticated clink of crystal glasses. It's a sound that signals a world where the hard scrub has been replaced by the soft silk. I find it relatable that we still use our homes to project the person we want to be, even if it's just by tidying up before a Zoom call. When you hear the soft swish of Madam Walker's silk gown as she moves across the marble floor, you're hearing the soundtrack of a woman who has conquered the boring USA. Personally, I find the Harlem and Hudson years to be a masterpiece of legacy building. She realized that wealth was a tool for visibility, a mainstream historical fact that allowed her to host the 1917 NAACP anti-lynching committee in her own living room. It was a rhythmic, opulent pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of strategic philanthropy. As the moon rises over the Hudson, casting long silver shadows of the mansion's terracotta roof across the manicured lawns, you realize that the doorbell of the Mansion of Dreams has a very heavy, resonant ring. You're part of the Harlem elite now, the ones who understand that beauty and power are two sides of the same coin. I suspect the move from her humble Denver office to this palatial estate was a win for prestige, but a loss of the quiet, simple anonymity she had as a washerwoman. You look at the custom-made furniture and the imported marble, and you can almost feel the mercantile hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a scalp treatment into a monument to achievement. I've always thought that the open house was the most honest part of her wealth. She frequently invited the public and her agents to tour the mansion, proving that her success was their success. It's an authentic, gritty bit of community sharing. You watch the visitors, many of whom had never been inside a house with indoor plumbing, walking with a rhythmic, awestruck reverence. I find it relatable that we still love a house tour today, looking for inspiration in someone else's aesthetic choices. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally knocking over a Ming vase and being quietly escorted out by the butler. But Walker maintained the physics of elegance. She was turning the boring USA into a place where Black excellence was physically undeniable. You settle into the stillness of the Harlem night, watching the way the city lights reflect off the Hudson. The gravity of the dream is a reminder that in the 1910s, a house wasn't just a place to live, it was a fortress against a world that wanted you to stay small. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she used her mansion as a platform for protest, proving that you could be fashionable and radical at the same time. It's a long way to the celebrity-owned mega mansions of the 21st century, but the prestige has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second. The rhythmic thrum-thrum of a distant jazz band lulling you into a state of historical peace. The invitations are sent, the mansion is lit, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the physics of influence. You take a final breath of the river-chilled air, feeling the scale of her legacy in your heart, and you wait. The protest march is forming. The checkbook is open, and the journey into philanthropy and the physics of influence. You leave the glittering crystal and silent pipe organs of Villa Lewero and step into a crowded, smoke-filled basement in Harlem, where the air is electric with the physics of radical hope. The year is 1917, and the conversation has shifted from hair growth to human rights. This is Philanthropy and the Physics of Influence, the chapter where Madam Walker proves that her wealth was never just about the roughneck luxury of silk sheets. It was a weapon for social engineering. Personally, I've always found it incredibly relatable that she didn't just write a check and disappear. She became a high-stakes power player who used her boring USA corporate infrastructure to fund the resistance. You're looking at a woman who is now a multimillionaire, but she is spending her Tuesday afternoon in a heated debate with the NAACP about the silent protest parade. And you realize that for Walker, the beauty empire was just the engine that drove the justice machine. I've always thought that Walker's version of philanthropy was the original strategic impact model. You see the evidence. She didn't just donate to schools, she endowed them with scholarships for Black women. She didn't just support the YWCA, she funded the building of the colored YMCA in Indianapolis. I find it relatable that we still look for tangible results in our charity today, though we usually just click a donate button on a website. Historians still argue whether her political activism, which was so radical it earned her a file in the War Department's military intelligence archives, was a threat to her business stability, or if her business was the only thing that made her untouchable by the law. Personally, I suspect her bank account was her primary suit of armor. It's hard for the sheriff to arrest the woman who pays half the town's property taxes. A quirky tidbit of this era is that Walker was so committed to the cause that she once pledged $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund, the largest single donation they had ever received, at a time when most Americans were earning less than $800 a year. You trudge along Fifth Avenue in July 1917, where the physics of the march is in full swing. This was the silent protest parade, where 10,000 Black men, women, and children marched in total silence to the beat of muffled drums to protest the East St. Louis riots. Madam Walker was at the forefront of the planning. I've always felt that 1917 was a very roughneck year for the American conscience. You had to physically put your body on the line. Standing in the foyer of the protest's headquarters, watching the rhythmic motion of women sewing white banners and mourning armbands, you realize that the white blouses of her sales force had become the uniform of the resistance. You listen to the physics of the drum, the rhythmic, hollow thud-thud of the muffled percussion echoing off the skyscrapers. It's a sound that signals a collective, disciplined grief. I find it relatable that we still feel that rhythmic unity in modern protests. The sense that 1,000 feet hitting the pavement together creates a physical vibration that cannot be ignored. When you hear the soft rustle of 10,000 people moving in absolute silence, you're hearing the soundtrack of a new era of Black political power. Personally, I find the philanthropy section to be a masterpiece of leveraged wealth. She realized that beauty was the front end of her life, but activism was the back-end code that made the whole system meaningful. It was a rhythmic, rebellious pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of corporate social responsibility. As the afternoon sun hits the gold trim of her office, casting long, rectangular shadows of the Walker Building across the Harlem sidewalk, you realize that the doorbell of the influence has a very sharp, urgent ring. You're part of the activist elite now, the ones who understand that you can't have comeliness in a world of chaos. I suspect the move from her early, quiet donations to these massive public political stands was a win for justice, but a loss of her personal safety. You look at her War Department file, which labeled her a Negro agitator, and you can almost feel the political hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a hair-grease tycoon into a revolutionary. I've always thought that her endowment strategy was the most honest part of her legacy. She wrote her will to ensure that 2/3 of her company's profits would always go to charity. It's an authentic, gritty bit of generational planning. You watch her sign the legal documents with a rhythmic, practiced hand. I find it relatable that we still worry about our legacy today, wondering if the work we do will matter after the boring USA forgets our name. Personally, I'd be the one getting distracted by the legal jargon and accidentally signing my house over to a stray cat. But Walker moved with the physics of a visionary. She was turning her personal success into a permanent institution. You settle into the stillness of the Harlem evening, watching the way the lamplight catches the ink on her latest protest telegram. The gravity of the cause is a reminder that in the 1910s, being a billionaire didn't protect you from the roughneck reality of racism. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she traveled to the White House to personally petition President Woodrow Wilson for anti-lynching legislation, even when he refused to see her. She didn't just take no for an answer. She went back to Harlem and organized harder. It's a long way to the massive, multinational nonprofit foundations of the 21st century, but the movement has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic shush-shush of her pen lulling you into a state of historical peace. The checks are signed, the marchers are ready, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the tropical steam of the Caribbean. You take a final breath of the ink and perfume air, feeling the integrity in your chest, and you wait. The ship is docking, the map is expanding, and the journey into the global vision and Caribbean steam. You leave the rhythmic urban pulse of New York and step onto the deck of a steamer where the air is suddenly heavy, salt-sprayed, and vibrating with the heat of the tropics. The year is 1913, though your influence stretches forward into 1918, and you are breathing in the physics of the Atlantic. This is The Global Vision and Caribbean Steam, the chapter where Madam Walker proves that the boring USA was never going to be big enough to hold her ambition. Personally, I've always found it a bit incredible that she was thinking about global supply chains at a time when most people hadn't even seen a map of the West Indies. It's the 1910s version of a multinational tech rollout, long before container ships and air freight made the world feel small. You're looking at the blue-green waters of the Caribbean, and you realize that for Walker, the African diaspora wasn't just a political concept, it was a massive, untapped consumer market. I've always thought that Walker's international expansion was the original roughneck version of a global franchise. You see the strategy. She traveled to Panama, Costa Rica, Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti, setting up agents and schools in every port. I find it relatable that we still talk about expanding your reach today, though for us, it usually just means changing our shipping settings on an e-commerce platform. For Walker, it meant physically boarding a ship, dealing with customs officials who didn't want to see a black woman with 10 trunks of secret formula, and pitching her system in the humid heat of a Panamanian afternoon. Historians still argue whether her international trip was a genuine business expansion or a much-needed escape from the exhausting physics of American racism. Personally, I suspect it was a brilliant blend of both. A working vacation where she could breathe the Caribbean air while simultaneously conquering the local beauty market. A quirky tidbit of this era is that Walker's products became so popular in the Canal Zone that laborers working on the Panama Canal would use her wonderful hair grower to treat scalp conditions caused by the relentless tropical sun and cement dust. You trudge through the colorful, bustling markets of Kingston or Port-au-Prince, where the air is scented with allspice, roasted coffee, and the familiar medicinal tang of Walker's sulfur ointment. This was the birth of the international agent. I've always felt that 1914 was a very roughneck year for global trade. You see the Walker kits being carried through the streets by women in Panama hats and light linen dresses. I find it relatable that we still feel that brand recognition when we see a familiar logo in a foreign country. It's a bit of domestic comfort in an unfamiliar landscape. Standing in the foyer of a Jamaican community hall, watching the rhythmic motion of local women learning the press and curl under the soft steam of a Caribbean kitchen, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the global beauty standard of the future. You listen to the physics of the harbor, the rhythmic, deep thrum-thrum of the steamer's engines, and the sharp, melodic calls of the dock workers in patois and French. It's a sound that signals a world without borders. I find it relatable that we still chase that jet-set lifestyle today, looking for the next horizon to conquer. When you hear the soft clink of a glass jar being sold for a handful of foreign coins, you're hearing the soundtrack of a pioneer. Personally, I find the Caribbean expansion to be a masterpiece of cultural connection. She realized that Black women everywhere shared the same scalp crisis, a mainstream historical fact that allowed her to build a bridge across the Atlantic with nothing but a tin of grease and a hot comb. It was a rhythmic, tropical pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of global Black commerce. As the sun sets over the turquoise horizon, casting long, violet shadows of the palm trees across the deck of the ship, you realize that the doorbell of the global vision has a very resonant, international ring. You're part of the transatlantic elite now, the ones who understand that a good idea doesn't need a passport. I suspect the move from her personal Caribbean tours to the massive automated export departments of her later years was a win for volume, but a loss of the raw, tactile excitement of opening a new country in person. You look at her travel diary, with its notes on local hair textures and weather conditions, and you can almost feel the mercantile hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a regional business into a worldwide system. I've always thought that her international correspondence was the most honest part of her expansion. She maintained a massive network of letters with her agents in the West Indies, providing them with the same physics of encouragement she gave her American agents. It's an authentic, gritty bit of long-distance mentorship. You watch the ship's mailroom clerk sorting through the Walker & Carbert's envelopes with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency. I find it relatable that we still value staying connected today, though our methods are a lot faster than a mailboat. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally dropping the mailbag into the ocean while trying to wave at a dolphin. But Walker demanded logistical excellence. She was turning the boring USA into a hub for a global community. You settle into the stillness of the tropical night, watching the way the stars seem to reflect off the black silk of the Caribbean Sea. The gravity of the ocean is a reminder that in the 1910s, a global vision required more than just a website. It required the roughneck stamina to cross an ocean. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she saw herself as a citizen of the world, refusing to let the boring USA define her limits. It's a long way to the massive multinational conglomerates of the 21st century beauty industry, but the exporting has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic slap-slap of the waves against the hull, lulling you into a state of historical peace. The kit is sold, the ship is turning home, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward the regulatory hubris of the patent wars. You take a final breath of the salt and vanilla air, feeling the scale of the world in your chest. And you wait. The lawyer is waiting, the imitators are forming, and the journey into legal battles and the patent war, you leave the salt-sprayed decks of the Caribbean steamer and step into a wood-paneled office where the air is no longer sweet with tropical vanilla, but sharp with the smell of old paper, fountain pen ink, and the physics of litigation. The year is 1918, and the boring USA is becoming a battlefield of intellectual property. This is Legal Battles and the Patent War, the chapter where Madam Walker defends her secret formula against 1,000 imitators. Personally, I've always found it a bit ironic that the more successful you are at solving a problem, the more people emerge from the woodwork claiming they thought of it first. It's the 1910s version of a patent troll or a copycat Amazon listing, and it required a very specific kind of roughneck legal stamina to survive. You're looking at a stack of cease and desist letters, and you realize that for Walker, the beauty empire was now a legal fortress. I've always thought that the War of the Hair Growers was the ultimate test of Walker's regulatory hubris. You see the conflict. Because she hadn't actually patented her formula, which would have required revealing the specific ratio of sulfur to petrolatum, she had to rely on trademark law to protect the name and the brand. I find it relatable that even today, we see brand wars between companies that sell essentially the same chemical mixture, but under different lifestyle banners. Historians still argue whether her most famous legal battle, with her former mentor, Annie Malone, was a genuine dispute over chemical theft, or a deeply personal rivalry between two women who simply couldn't share the same mountain. Personally, I suspect it was a bit of both. A high-stakes game of commercial chess, where the prize was the loyalty of every black woman in America. A quirky tidbit of this era is that many imitators would use names like Madam Walker's Style Grower, or the original Walker method, forcing the real Madam Walker to add a warning to the public on every single tin. I'd be the guy in the store squinting at the labels, wondering why there are 5 different Madams, all promising me the same miracle. You trudge into a courtroom where the physics of testimony is in full swing. This wasn't the soft steam of the kitchen anymore. It was the cold, hard reality of the poison register of legal facts. I've always felt that 1918 was a very roughneck year for the American courtroom. You had to prove that your secret was actually yours. Standing in the foyer of the courthouse, watching the rhythmic motion of lawyers shuffling affidavits and chemical analyses, you realize that the pharmacy of the past had become the courtroom drama of the future. You listen to the physics of the argument, the rhythmic, authoritative drone of a lawyer explaining the nuances of unfair competition, and the sharp clack of a judge's gavel. It's a sound that signals a world where a brand is a piece of property. I find it relatable that we still feel that legal anxiety today, whether it's a terms of service agreement we didn't read or a copyright strike on a video. When you hear the soft rustle of a settlement agreement being signed, you're hearing the soundtrack of a woman who has secured her borders. Personally, I find the patent war section to be a masterpiece of brand defense. She realized that a secret formula is only as good as your ability to sue anyone who tries to steal it. It was a rhythmic, litigious pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the concept of corporate IP protection. As the evening shadows grow long over the law books, casting rectangular shadows of the mahogany shelves across the green felt of the desk, you realize that the doorbell of the patent war has a very sharp, metallic ring. You're part of the legal elite now, the ones who understand that authenticity is a legal status, not just a feeling. I suspect the move from her simple handshake deals in Denver to these massive multi-state legal battles was a win for security, but a loss of the raw, communal trust she had when she was just Sarah Breedlove. You look at the authentic Walker seal, a gold-embossed sticker of her own face, and you can almost feel the mercantile hubris of the 1910s. It was a bit of domestic theater that turned a paper label into a shield of integrity. I've always thought that her warning to the public was the most honest part of her branding. She would explicitly tell her customers, "If it doesn't have my face, it isn't my formula." It's an authentic, gritty bit of self-preservation. You watch the factory girls applying the face labels with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. I find it relatable that we still look for that verified checkmark or official store badge today to avoid being scammed. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally sticking the labels on my own forehead and being sold as a premium scalp treatment. But Walker demanded branding consistency. She was turning the boring USA into a place where a person's face was their most valuable trademark. You settle into the stillness of the office, watching the way the lamplight reflects off the inkwell. The gravity of the law is a reminder that in the 1910s, building an empire meant you had to be a roughneck in the boardroom as much as the kitchen. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the fact that she never backed down from a fight, even when she was up against massive white-owned companies that tried to gentrify her inventions. She protected her people and her products with the same physics of fierceness she used to escape the cotton fields. It's a long way to the massive multi-billion-dollar patent litigation of the 21st century tech giants. But the defending has truly begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic shush-shush of the legal pads lulling you into a state of historical peace. The suits are settled, the trademarks are registered, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move Madam Walker toward her final legacy. You take a final breath of the ink and cedar air, feeling the security in your chest, and you wait. The final ledger is opening. The sun is setting on a century, and the journey into the final legacy and a quiet wind down. You leave the sharp, ink-scented air of the legal offices and return to the quiet, dignified halls of Villa Lewaro. The year is 1919, and the boring USA is finally catching its breath after the Great War. But the air around you feels different, thinner, softer, and heavy with the scent of a long journey coming to its rest. This is the final legacy and a quiet wind down. The chapter where Sarah Breedlove, the daughter of the Delta, closes the grand leather-bound ledger of her life. Personally, I've always found it a bit moving how she spent her final months not in retreat, but in a state of high-altitude reflection. She was a woman who had mastered the physics of upward mobility until there was nowhere left to climb. You're looking at a woman who is only 51 years old, her body tired from decades of hard scrub and industrial thrum, yet her spirit remains as bright as a gaslight flame in a dark room. I've always thought that Madam Walker's final act was the ultimate roughneck version of grace. You see the evidence of her preparation. She spent her final weeks ensuring that the Walker system would survive her, confirming the leadership of her daughter, Alelia, and her trusted attorney, F.B. Ransom. I find it relatable that even at the end, we worry about the continuity of our work, whether it's a business empire or just making sure the plants get watered while we're gone. Historians still argue whether her early death was the inevitable result of the physical friction of her life, years of lye steam, coal soot, and the relentless stress of the patent wars, or if it was simply the tragic limit of a heart that had beaten too hard for too many people. Personally, I suspect it was the physics of intensity. You can't burn as brightly as she did without using up the wick. A quirky tidbit of this era is that upon her passing, she was hailed by the New York Times as the wealthiest black woman in America, a mainstream historical fact that forced the boring USA to finally acknowledge a titan it had tried to ignore. You trudge one last time through the mansion of dreams, where the light of the setting sun filters through the stained glass, casting long, kaleidoscopic shadows across the marble floors. This was the birth of a permanent inspiration. I've always felt that May 1919 was a very roughneck month for the American soul. You see the legacy she left behind. Thousands of women who were no longer washerwomen, a national political movement that now had a war chest, and a beauty industry that finally saw the dignity in black hair. Standing in the foyer of her bedroom, listening to the rhythmic, distant sigh of the Hudson River, you realize that the soft kitchen steam of the past had become the atmospheric presence of the future. The world has become very quiet now, hasn't it? The rhythmic thump-clack of the factory machines has faded into a distant, metallic echo, and the sharp, sulfurous scent of the original ointment has settled into a gentle, floral hum of memory. You can feel the heaviness in your limbs, that deep, comfortable warmth that comes when the journey from the cotton fields to the mansion is finally over, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The grand white blouse conventions and the Caribbean steamers are just shadows now, drifting away into the soft focus mist of the past. You are safe, tucked away from the river mist and the laundry lie, surrounded by the quiet legacy of a woman who refused to be boring. The flickering oil lamp of history has been turned down low, and the bruised purple sky over the Hudson has turned into a blanket of infinite silent stars. Each star is like a single drop of glycine in the vast cosmic jar of the night, holding everything together while you rest. You don't need to worry about the patent wars, the legal affidavits, or the apprentice's grind anymore. They are part of the architecture now, as steady and solid as the terracotta roof of Villa Lewaro. Your breathing has slowed to match the rhythmic sigh of the pine trees in the valley, a long, slow exhale that carries away the last of the day's industrial tension. The boring USA is at peace, and you are part of that peace. Let the imagery of the bubbling kitchen pots and the silver hot combs fade into a soft, golden amber glow. There are no more labels to apply, no more jars to ship, and no more speeches to give. There is only the hum of the fan, the softness of the pillow, and the long, slow drift into a dreamless sleep. The ledgers are closed. The empire is secure. Everything is exactly as it should be. Close your eyes now. The circuit is open, the formula is pure, and the world is finally still. The soft steam has finally cleared from the kitchen window, leaving only the cool evening air and the vast stillness of a dream fulfilled. As you settle deeper into the warmth of your blankets, let the images of the past, the rhythmic scrub of the washboard, the bright gold seals on the diplomas, and the long white lines of the protest march, soften into a blurred, gentle haze. The weight of the day's work has lifted, replaced by the effortless gravity of sleep. You are drifting now, carried by the slow, steady current of the Mississippi, moving past the Delta shadows and the St. Louis wharves, toward a place of absolute quiet. There are no more mountains to climb, no more fires to tend, and no more names to forge in the heat of the stove. The air is cool, scented with the faint, lingering sweetness of vanilla and the clean, silent spirit of the Hudson. Your heart beats in a slow, peaceful rhythm, a quiet echo of the millions of lives that were changed by a single, stubborn dream. The world is dark, the stars are watching, and the legacy is safe in the keeping of the night. Sleep now, for the journey is complete, and the morning is a lifetime away. Everything is still. Everything is at rest. Sweet dreams.